Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now, we have a bit of an interesting show today. It's a bit slower than our past few, but still pretty much. And as I was saying in our pre show chat, again, it's one of those shows that not where you're thinking, oh, it's the greatest white pill ever. It's, just great news, but it's also not one of those shows that makes you want to run into the bunker and prepare for the worst. It's kind of, it's odd. There actually is a little bit of elements of both, but, they balance out at the point where, again, it's actually just interesting the fact that so much happened out of so little. And I suppose I'll get started now with our news in Syria, as we have been starting out with the past couple of weeks. Now, very, very good news out of Syria and very revealing news out of Syria. So, southwestern Syria has been all but rid of Islamic State positions, and Syria now controls everything up until the border of the de-escalation zone of the Golan Heights. Now, the defeat of ISIS and other groups, after they defeated, of course, they were raiding their warehouses, seeing what intelligence, what they found on them. And Syria had claimed to find supplies originating from Israel. Now, if this were the case, it would be of no surprise to me. For example, the picture that they showed in the article I looked at was basically a bunch of canned food with Hebrew markings on it. There were some Israeli weapons, some, rifles with, Hebrew markings on them. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if this happened. But I also don't put it past the Syrian government to lie. All governments lie for their purposes, just something that happens. Now, to save face or destroy evidence, take your pick on this one. The Israelis decided to strike ISIS positions in southern Syria for the first time since ISIS, existed in Syria. So make what you will of that.
A tremendous betrayal.
Yes, old friends and allies stabbing each other in the back. It's so sad. Now, more news out of Syria is Putin met with Erdogan and Rouhani to hammer out a peace deal in Syria. Now, this is the first of many, not the first, but this is one of many meetings he has had with both Erdogan and Rouhani. I believe it was in Sochi. And I didn't see too many specifics about the deal, but, it was always that photo op with all of them shaking hands. I'm sure you've seen a million of them at this point because they've had a million of these summits. And what came out of that, presumably, is... some news is that Russia assured Turkey that no major operations were planned for Idlib, and Turkey agreed to rid the province of militants. Now, if you'll recall, Turkey basically annexed Afrin, which was a supply line right into Idlib, which was basically the main holdout of groups like al-Nusra and HTS. And, allegations have been that Turkey had been supporting them and supplying them, allegations which I believe there's sufficient evidence for. But more news out of this is... the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, quote unquote, and basically entirely Kurdish groups, that was the rebranding from the YPG, had agreed to hand over a significant portion of northern Syria to Assad's forces. Now, this hints at the end of a U.S. role in Syria, seeing as most U.S. forces, at least under Trump, were in Kurdish-controlled positions. So, I don't know whether this is happening without Trump's consent, or what I find more likely based on his rhetoric over the past few months, that Trump basically cut off the Kurds and let them fend for themselves, and they made an agreement with Assad so they wouldn't become the next Afrin. Seeing as the Kurdish groups in Afrin basically suffered the fate of Turkish conquest because they were too stubborn to work with the Assadist forces.
Yeah, I would agree. And just think 2 months ago, I didn't think this was possible, to be honest.
I mean,
Uh,
same. I had pretty bad thoughts 2 months ago, if I'm not gonna lie.
I honestly thought that that section controlled by the Kurds north of the Euphrates could very well end up being some kind of Kurdistan. But as it so happens, I think I can see now Erdogan's invasion into Syria was in a way to preempt and set up a situation just like this as a bargaining chip. That is, you're not going to have a Kurdish state next to Turkey. You can have it somewhere, but it can't be next to Turkey. And so now, of course, Assad wants his country back. He wants certain sections back. He wants Idlib back. And Erdogan is able to play this successfully. So it seems like a lot of all those forces associated with the Arab Peninsula states and well, definitely, America, Israel, and France included, are in a retreat. So Yeah, I'm pleased to hear this.
I would, yeah, definitely agree with everything that you said there. And um, with Turkey siding with Russia, more or less, and the White Helmets out, and the U.S. is slowly also leaving Syria, as I just mentioned. The war in Syria is coming to a close, actually much later than I expected. In my more naive days, I thought Assad had this in the bag and that he was just going to, steamroll the factions. But then, I learned about more influences. The fact that the war was more multidimensional than I previously had thought. But again, this is all very good news. And even on top of that, in signs of more de-escalation, Iran has moved artillery positions away from the Golan Heights, which, you all know, is disputed territory between the Israelis and the Syrians.
Hmm. Yeah, Iran is playing this well as well. They moved in order to be able to have a better negotiating power later on, and it has worked out for them. Like strategically, this war in the closing year has been handled extremely well. Um, there hasn't been a kind of rash action by any of the partners. We have to understand that, Iran, Assad, Syria, Russia are nowhere near the capability and power of the West or whatever elite order that we're talking about, and they've had to play this extremely well, and they've been able to negotiate their way. Uh, to secure the country almost back to where it was pre-war. I mean, there's still lots of work. I understand, north of the Euphrates, there's still a very large section that's controlled by Kurdish forces.
But seeing, the recent peace agreements, we'll have to,
Yeah,
see how
yeah,
that goes.
that's the general arc. Yeah, it seems at this point an inevitability.
I mean, Assad apparently was not lying when he said every inch will be liberated. I mean, did, did he mean the Golan Heights? But granted, over the next few years, Israel, as you'll see later in the show, they're feeling a lot of pressure. Israel is very nervous right now. They're on their toes, and they're pushing very hard for certain things in the U.S. And they may give up the Golan Heights out of fear, or anything could happen at this point. But I generally see this going in an optimistic direction. But let's move on to our next topic of Afghanistan. So, about 17 years after a peak, 17 years after war, and around a peak of 110,000 troops, the U.S. has opened negotiations with the Taliban in Qatar. Now, a lot of people will be outraged about this, which the outrage will, of course, be spearheaded by the neoconservative establishment. Now, what we have to understand, a lot of people say, oh, Trump's negotiating with the people who did 9/11. He's selling out America. Well, let's understand this. If you believe the official narrative, which I do to an extent, Al Qaeda was the group behind 9/11. Now, granted, I believe Al Qaeda did this attack because they were being supported by the Saudis, and you can look at the evidence. The Saudi embassy funded dry runs of the attack, and Israel withheld intelligence. A lot of things played into it, but let's accept the general narrative that it was Osama bin Laden planning an attack on the United States of America and that he succeeded. Well, let's consider the fact that when we found Osama bin Laden in 2011, he was in Pakistan, as well as most high ranking Al Qaeda officials were in Pakistan, and that the Al Qaeda presence and Taliban control Afghanistan at the time, because the Taliban actually was the government ruling Afghanistan. There was the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan at the time. We're not on good terms with the Taliban. Now, there may have been some initial harboring, but things went very sour very quickly after the Soviet Union left. They almost immediately turned on each other. They may have not been officially in another civil war, but they might as well have been.
Yeah, my own take on 9/11 is that it was even more muddled than that. That there was an element of the Americans and Israelis, along with the Saudis, that facilitated this to happen. I mean, this look, if you do the research, it's obvious that most of these hijackers were monitored and controlled everywhere from Indonesia to Germany to Florida for well over 2 years. Their plans were well known. There were certain case officers that were renting rooms next to where they were, including one Israeli official who didn't show up on the day of. He's of Arab descent, but apparently was part of this plot. I don't think, in my opinion, Osama bin Laden was never killed in Pakistan. I honestly think that the guy never made it. If we're supposed to believe he was on a dialysis machine and, coordinating all these attacks from a cave in Afghanistan, I just hardly, I just doubt that. Like,
I mean that's a reasonable take, but I'm doing the devil advocate argument that we're following the official story
right,
of
right.
9/11, barring the new evidence that they're trying to new quote unquote evidence that they're trying to tie the Iranians to this. But shortly after these negotiations, the Taliban began routing ISIS attacks in Afghanistan, started stepping up attacks against them. Since you got to keep in mind, the Taliban still controls about half of Afghanistan.
Hmm. Yeah, in a way, everything has come full circle. From the days of the Mujahideen, which the Taliban is an offshoot of that from '79. They're back with them again. But I mean, I would take the Taliban over, you know, ISIS or whatever, whatever trending jihadist group there happens to be.
Yeah, I mean, the Taliban isn't looking for global expansion. They're looking for the, emirate of Afghanistan, which they had, in which they kind of shut up after they got it. So, again, I believe, attacking Taliban-controlled Afghanistan was opening up a can of worms. So, but just on the Afghan war in general, we've been there for almost 17 years. Coming up in October, it'll be 17 years. Most of the people over there fighting in it don't even remember 9/11 or why this war started. And I believe this is fundamentally a good sign, again, I don't care who controls Afghanistan. Afghanistan means nothing to me, and also who controls Afghanistan really means nothing to the average American. We have no interest in, you know, this country in Central Asia that can barely govern itself. So, if we do hand it over to the Taliban, if they succeed, if they fail, again, it's none of my concern. And I think Trump, funny enough, you actually need someone with civilian eyes in there to realize, oh, hey, maybe we should be getting out of Afghanistan. And this comes after early on his term, like back when Steve Bannon was still in the White House with him. So yeah, you know how early we're
Yeah,
talking then.
yes.
Basically, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think all the major powers are going to have some presence in Afghanistan, one way or another. Uh, I think in some ways Afghanistan's, future is going to be determined by who can reason and figure out a diplomacy with it the best, kind of the way it was when it was in the communist sphere of influence. Why? Because it has very valuable minerals, and a country like China needs those minerals in order to keep its economy going. So far, China and Russia have been, very reasonable. They make deals with various countries that, culturally speaking, they have nothing in common. And this is a very sort of old-fashioned take on the way on the way nations did trading for centuries. Very different than the way America does it, where the country has to literally adopt certain isms and idioms and ways and a worldview more similar to that of America, regardless of whether there was even some natural cultural aggregate that had formed in order to arrive at those ideas and opinions. So but I can't like I don't mean this in a negative way. I don't mean that America isn't going to leave because it wants another war. This or the war to continue forever. I just mean it's too important because it's a little country that has a lot of significance. So I think there's always going to be an element there, and then it's going to be probably more than just spies. This goes for Russia as well. It's just it's a very important Central Asian country right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I was kind of dismissive with it in my previous rant, but like I said, to the average American, there's other places, at least America can get the resources. Kind of different story for the Chinese, but yeah, maybe I say that,
Yeah,
after
yeah.
some war fatigue because we've been there, ever since I can remember. But that's again all aside the point. And yeah, I think this is generally positive. And you could kind of tie this back to the Iran thing. Maybe Trump wants to get those troops out of there, either prepare them for war with Iran, which I severely doubt, or he wants them outside of Iranians missiles range of fire. So yeah, again, we were actually discussing this changing American role in the world. We'll possibly have an episode on that further down the road, but I think it's a good time to get into North Korea if you're ready for that.
Sure.
So North Korea has been a bit of a mixed bag, at least in the narrative around it. Now, not much has happened, but the neocons are really quick to try to show how much Trump failed, and all the usual suspects, the hard left, the resist crowd. But some good news first is North Korea allowed POW remains to be returned from the U.S. from the Korean War to the relatives. I mean, it was a war, 60 years ago at this point, to the relatives who may still be alive, or at least, even if not, we can, give them a proper, properly lay them to rest. So it's not much of a concession, but it is more of a symbolic move, kind of an olive branch showing we have no hostility towards you. And they gave it to us, without any concessions. They didn't demand any money or any, political gain out of it. They basically said, yeah, here, have these back. We kind of want to put this behind us.
Yeah. Um, like I say, there's going to be three spheres of importance and influence going forward for America, regardless of they can expand depending on who's in power, but there are three that are going to be very important, and that's the Persian Gulf, Europe, and China, the South China Sea. Korea is also part of this.
Just East
Uh,
Asia in general.
yeah, just yeah, Northeast Asia, absolutely. And it's in America's interest to also have North Korea united. That keeps a check on China. That makes Japan feel more at ease. Um,
It also gives the
so
Koreans they can become a power.
yeah, like I mean, and we don't, we're not that aware of it, because of where we are. But I would say in that theater of Northeast Asia, that what is happening in Korea is as important as what's happening in the Persian Gulf or Central and Eastern Europe right now. It's on that magnitude. And we also mustn't forget that culturally, these people are far more reticent to share what they really believe or what they would like to see happen. That has been their culture, their civilization for millennia. Um, so we have to do a little bit more guesswork and a little bit more deduction. But yeah, I mean, you're asking like it's it's huge to ask a country, even a country like North Korea, to give up its, to lay down essentially in some way or another. Um, it, it's not a threat. It never was a threat. North Korea represents a much bigger negotiation about where America's power and influence is going to go in the next 20 years in Northeast Asia.
Yeah,
It's not about the missiles. No, I'm not
yeah,
saying that you're saying that, but I'm saying, to a normie audience, they'll presume that's what it is, because of
yeah.
the,
I would
the
definitely agree.
yearly, yeah, yeah,
And I think, our diplomacy with Korea would have been much more successful, throughout the past decades if, we did frame it. It's like, not that North Korea is this rogue state, but, the fact of its proximity and importance to China. Because, like you said, it all boils down to its proximity and importance to China. United Korea, fundamentally benefits everyone but China in that case.
Mhm.
But there's some more news out of Korea, more good news. So North Korean and South Korean officials are meeting at the neutral zones they have in the DMZ. I'm sure you've seen the meeting rooms they have, like basically built within the walls, to discuss
Yeah,
how to ease tensions and how to basically demilitarize the border and turn to an actual demilitarized zone. So that's very positive. Now a lot of people, like a lot of the more anti-Trump crowd, will try to say they would have done that anyway. Now granted, they've had these negotiations in the past, but especially with Trump's summit and his continued diplomacy with them, I think things are accelerating much faster than they would have in the past. I'm not denying this would have happened anyway. I am saying it's a multifaceted effort, and I say Trump deserves quite a bit of credit for it, but of course not all of it. And I'm glad that the two Koreas are talking again for all the reasons we just listed. The fact that basically United Korea, benefits everyone but China, and China is the basically our main rival at this point, at least by my assessment.
yeah, yeah. I would agree with that assessment. And North Korea could be looking at joining with South Korea is ultimately a better future for itself. So, and that's China will have to find a way to convince them that that's not the case. Um, And that seems, I think, long run, that seems monumental right now.
I mean, China better be sweetening that pot because, just the
Yeah, yeah.
way things are. But, after all of this progress, the quote unquote intelligence agencies come out and say North Korea all of a sudden decide to expand its missile arsenal. Now, you look at this, especially, I think it's funny, which, again, we'll get into this later. After Trump's olive branch to the Iranians, that North Korea all of a sudden decides, build the missiles, which, we got to realize there was never a deal, a formalized deal. It was just diplomacy. It was just a handshake and smile that everyone gets. That you get out of these kind of meetings, and no formalized deal has been reached on either denuclearization or any other forms of arms control. And North Korea building missiles is a completely natural reaction to the current climate. Things may be going well, but they don't know if things could turn completely sour tomorrow. They want it deterrent. And what a lot of people don't realize about missiles is they could do a lot of damage with just conventional explosives on there, but yeah, people are making way too big of a deal of this. This is definitely a political move to delegitimize Trump on the domestic side, on his foreign policy side, and to try to turn him more hawkish towards countries like Iran, at least in my assessment.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, America right now, it's an interesting game that they're playing. If we look at this, about where America's geopolitical direction was supposed to go had Hillary won, then you could say that this is, the smoke that is, we're going to evaluate everything and scrutinize everything that Trump does in order to prove we were right and she should have won. That's just, that's a smokescreen. I think they had a deal with which way America was going to go. The Iran deal was part of that. Syria was not. So, and North Korea, it's unclear to me, but they are using the current climate of 100% scrutiny of everything Trump does as a way, I think, to delegitimize, like not just delegitimize what he's doing, but actually find a way to steer things in a different way. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
we also
I
have to
think
keep in
they
mind,
had. I think they were
just
on, like, to boil it down. I think they were on the side of China and against whoever in Saudi Arabia and Israel to to demolish Syria. And I think that that is what has them really worried. Not that Trump is a bad negotiator. That's just the surface level. Obviously, Trump, I think, is honest because 4 years ago I said, if America wants to contain China, if they want to do something, they're going to have to court Russia, and they're going to have to do it really well. I think Trump is trying to do that.
yeah, I would definitely agree. I think a lot of what Trump's approach towards Russia isn't from this genuine desire for peace or the fact that he's some Russophile or controlled by Russia. I think it's that he correctly sees, as we went over some of those intelligence officers that we mentioned last episode, correctly see that China is the major threat to America and honestly the world at this point, especially with their economic policies. And I think he's willing to court Russia and work with Russia to prevent China from running roughshod. But the funny thing about this Korean thing, they talk about, oh, North Korea's expanded missile arsenal a little. They've also dismantled several nuclear and missile test sites before this. So, they do one thing that looks like a setback that isn't really that much, and all of a sudden it's the end of the world. But I want to move on to the Trump's meeting with Giuseppe Conte, of course, the Prime Minister of Italy. Now, this is a bit of a smaller story, but I think it shows what direction America's going in, at least culturally and domestically. That plays out to it, and some stuff relating to Iran, because apparently everything just comes back around to Iran this episode. So on Monday, Trump met with the populist Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte at the White House. Now it's interesting because Conte, you don't hear much about him. You hear more about Salvini, who's the deputy prime minister and really the face of the current government. But of course, the official prime minister has to do his role. Now, both espoused very nationalist rhetoric at the press conference. They were talking about a nation must be willing to secure its borders and just rhetoric like that. Aside from that, it wasn't a very eventful meeting, but it's actually interesting because Italy, we've discussed this, how basically Rome was going to become the place of all the new international summits between rivals. Italy maintains a decent relationship with Iran, especially as far as a Western power is concerned. So,
Hmm.
you know,
As it does with Russia.
yeah, despite, of course, the growing nationalism in both countries and how both countries are going in a similar direction domestically and both in foreign policy for that matter, it also represents an important bridge for if Trump wants to actually reach out to these more uh, hostile countries, whether the hostile be initiated by the U.S. or that country is irrelevant, whether he wants to reach out to countries like Russia and Iran, Italy is a good bridge for that.
Hmm. Yeah, and it reminds me a little bit when Trump visited Poland. I mean, he is definitely using the rhetoric of nationalism. But just to put this in a larger context, you can see that there is a timeline, an arc that's developing. If we're going to say that America is preparing to move to a multipolar, unipolar world, then it's going to court countries with ideas about nationalism. Because overall, nationalism will always endure over internationalism, or the other name for internationalism, of course, if you're the most powerful one, it's called empire. Um, so to me,
Yeah.
that signals that Trump actually understands the direction, or the direction best suited for America in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Otherwise, he wouldn't be courting, and he would not be saying these things with, not an obviously nationalist leader. So I look at this as something that's very positive.
Now, of course, this also plays into his strategy with the EU. Now, Trump fundamentally would, both the US and Russia would actually like to see the breakup of the EU, both for very different reasons. Mainly, it makes it easier to break them up as a trade bloc and trade with individual countries and bring them more into your sphere. So, I believe Trump does want to work with these nationalistic leaders because they present a threat to the EU, which at the end of the day is good for the United States. So that is also another reason he has been reaching out to countries like Hungary and Italy and Poland and I believe even Austria at this point. But
Hmm.
that's actually a perfect segue into our next topic, which is about the EU, mainly Orban's proposed "quote unquote" populist bloc. Now, as the EU falters, populists rise, as we've just been discussing. Now, during a recent address, Viktor Orban, of course, Prime Minister of Hungary, laid out a 5-point plan to rebuild Europe and basically post EU because I don't know, he's probably anticipating that the European Union isn't going to survive, which I think is a very reasonable assessment. Now, his 5 points were defend Christian values and reject multiculturalism. Number two, defend the family. Number three, defend national economic and market sector, so a bit of protectionism, economic nationalism. Number four, defend national borders. And number five, the European Union cannot deny a country's democracy. You think, like the recent Italian elections, they tried to get the president of Italy to overturn the election results because the president of Italy at the end of the day was just a stooge, or how they've had referendum after referendum in Ireland until Ireland actually joined the EU. So basically, trying to wane the political power of the EU. And I think those are very good 5 points, not only on a personal level, but for the survival of these countries and especially these Eastern European countries, this whole new nationalistic front. Now, this also shows a significant fracture from the neoliberal Western European countries, both socially and economically, and the fact that despite their skepticism of Russia, these countries have a lot more in common with Russia. Now, we discussed previously, when we were talking about NATO during the NATO summit, that fundamentally Europe could break down into several just regional alliances, and the fact that if countries like Austria and Italy and Poland and Hungary were to form an alliance, it still would be enough to deter a Russian invasion of Poland because, they could win, but they want to put the manpower to that, nor would they have the economic strength. But I think that plays into it. And, I think, as time goes on, as people start to forget the Soviet era, they will reach more out to the Russians and the West alike. Again, they'll do what the secondary powers do and, try to court both sides, see what's going on. But this also plays in the fact that Orban wants to form a bloc with other like minded nations, for example, the one I just listed in the EU Parliament, to try to usher in what he called a Christian democracy as opposed to liberal democracy.
The, this is huge. This is really,
Oh
really
yeah,
very huge.
probably the biggest
Uh,
white pill of the show, if I'm being honest.
Absolutely. White pill, a total rejection of the liberal order. The word Christian literally is acid on the skin to the globalist. Yeah, it can't be underestimated. I don't think this is just talk anymore. I think for whatever his reasons that he wants to go in this direction, um, I think it's genuine. I certainly think, from a Machiavellian point of view, that if he's not genuine, then he knows that this will suit him very well. I don't mean to be too cynical, but um, there is definitely a tide that's turning. I put in a tweet, I think it was yesterday, where I said, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you began to hear in America and other Western countries the phrase "I'm a citizen of the world," and that's interesting because as America became the unipolar power of the world, suddenly you become a world citizen. But none of them are actually cognizant why they think they're a world citizen. That none of them would link it with that their country has now conquered the world. And we have arrived at a moment where we have lived the unipolar world, and we have lived it for a quarter of a century. And other countries who have been part of that have also lived it. And that's why I say I think this is actually sincere. I don't think it's just the fear of migrants coming into Hungary. I think Orban and Hungarians know that Hungary can't support them, except in a kind of a relief effort for France and Germany and Sweden. I think there is an emptiness to the neoliberal order, and I think this is a reaction to it. I think this is a search for we can argue if this is the right method or not. We can say that it's an attempt, but I think it's sincere.
Oh, I think it's actually a bit in leading power. I mean, probably just because, but their economy and military both eclipsed. But yeah, I think actually the weakest country in the bloc, but a spokesperson for it at least. And again, I think this for just the shifting order and the return to what they were. In fact, pre World War I, when we actually had a geopolitical multiple power, the whatever globalism we have now. So I think things have played out well, but let's get into the big topic of the show, which is the whole Iran debacle, the Trump-Iran tango, as I titled it. So
Oh,
ever
tango
since
in all
Trump's,
caps.
ever since Trump's, all caps have been chaotic, but not to think, oh, we better get in the bunker and prepare for the worst. So this is actually a bit of old news, actually from last weekend. General Qasem, who is the commander of the Iranian forces in Syria, and pretty much Assad is still, and he's president of Iran, begins a war. War would mean destruction of all your assets. Our force, uh, the
Sorry,
Red Sea is no longer.
you're cutting out, Constantine.
Back
I
in
didn't
a
I didn't
second.
catch the last bit. Sorry, fellas. I'm sure Constantine will be back very soon. Oh, there we go.
Okay,
Hey,
I apologize, everyone. That's with the show for some reason. how, as I was saying, basically in response to Trump's tweet last week, again, this is a bit old news from last week, actually. Qasem Soleimani, who's the commander of the Iranian forces in Syria, very high-ranking president of Iran, responded to Trump saying, if it begins a war, Iran will be the one that finishes it. You know such a war would mean the destruction of all your assets in the region. Our forces are a match for yours, safe for Americans. So, in a way, he was threatening, but he also showed, like, yeah, I really don't want to go to war because it would be very costly for both of us. Do it. He also plays up these that the U.S. may have with Iran concerning the fact unofficial cooperation in the war against ISIS in Iraq, citing that basically, oh yeah, I helped fight ISIS in Iraq, and my military operations may have saved some American troops. It also has mentioned successes of Iranian-aligned groups such as the Houthis and Hezbollah, saying, "Oh, look what our guerrilla fighters can do, and we would give you a run for your money." But again, he's also echoing the sentiment, yeah, I really don't want to go to war, which is the same sentiment echoed by the Secretary of Defense, of course, James Mattis. Of course, all you know, Mad Dog Mattis, which kind of an unfitting nickname considering how much of the voice for peace he's been as of late. But he basically said he wanted to avoid a war or regime change in Iran because it would be too costly.
Yeah, and Trump wouldn't get elected. He wouldn't get reelected.
Yeah.
It's really that simple. I think the moment, the sort of America-Iran moment is coming in. It's going to come in November when the sanctions on Iran come into play, and this will mean no buying or selling of Iranian oil using American money. That's, I think, so look to the fall for things to really start to stir up, and how that might play with the primaries as well.
Yeah, like I said, as I've laid out in several times in the past, I don't see a U.S.-Iranian war. And Secretary Mattis's further comments actually go to back this up because there were some reports in the Australian media around, like, actually a day after we did, last week's episode, that Trump was preparing to strike Iranian nuclear reactors as soon as next month, which would imply August based on the time the article was published. Now, I thought this was bogus from the beginning. As soon as I saw this on Twitter, as soon as I saw Zero Hedge tweet this out. Now, Trump said when he let the Iran deal that his main concern was Iran's missile program. And Secretary Mattis went as far as to refute these comments, saying that the United States is not seeking regime change in Iran.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's positive. You get mixed signals. Nikki Haley doesn't seem to be on board with that. I mean, there's even talk of Nikki Haley and Pence running in 2020. I mean, we can't forget that Trump is he's on a tightrope.
Yeah, I mean, the Bill Kristol of the world would love that. I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, Trump's approval amongst Republicans, within the party is 88% as opposed to 9% disapproval. I honestly do hope they try to run someone like Nikki Haley against him in a primary because it would just crush the floor, and I think it would deal another much-needed blow to the neoconservative establishment. So I kind of do hope that happens, but it's funny that you mentioned that because that plays directly into my next point that Mattis's comments show that there's a mini civil war within the Trump administration. Pompeo and Haley and Bolton seem committed to the idea using MEC and these other, quote-unquote resistance groups as a means of regime change. So you could chalk it up to the point that, of course, there are going to be disagreements within the administration. But fortunately for us, based on previous events, mainly the Syria strikes earlier this year, Trump has more respect for General Mattis and his ideas than probably anyone else within his cabinet or even inner circle.
Yeah, Mattis has surprised me. This is a different Mattis than the one that was being hyped, especially on Twitter. But you always have to be careful with Twitter. But leading up and after the election in 2016, he's far wiser than some of the neocon hotheads that seem desperate for a war or subjugation or a regime change in Iran. And you know what? It could be that all of this will come down to some kind of negotiation. I hope it does. I also hope that it doesn't leave Iran vulnerable because leaving Iran too vulnerable, first of all, is a problematic situation both for the Russians and for the Chinese. And at this moment, America needs the Russians and the Chinese for negotiations, especially the Russians. I doubt Russia is going to sacrifice relations with Iran strictly for its own benefit. I think they still depend on each other quite a lot with the way things are at the moment. So, uh, a toothless Iran will be a country that'll be victim to Israel. And these ballistic missiles are only about that. They're not about, blowing up Israel. I mean, you
I
would
mean, they're
think,
medium range, which implies they're defensive. I mean, they would have ICBMs if they wanted to, strike
yeah,
Western targets or Israel.
exactly, right? What they don't want are incursions by Israeli jets, which have happened repeatedly.
Yeah, there's that U shape they fly around through Jordan and Iraq. Sometimes it,
Well,
passing the Iranian airspace.
they literally killed over a dozen Iranian scientists a few years ago by flying directly into Iranian space. So it makes sense that they would want them. I see Russia working out a deal for their S-400 or S-300 at the very least.
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting that you bring up Russia because we have no idea what happened behind the closed door meeting with Trump and Putin. A lot of this could be bluster. And, I'm almost certain they talked about the Iran issue and tried to, reach a more diplomatic solution to it. But interestingly enough, after a week of fiery rhetoric, Trump came out and said he'd be willing to meet with Iranian President Rouhani with no preconditions and that it would not be a sign of strength nor weakness, but an appropriate move. Now, this was actually followed by an Israeli source saying that U.S. and Iran have been discussing possibilities to modify the existing nuclear deal, with Oman mediating the agreement. Now, Iran says it will not compromise on its ballistic missiles. Of course, that's going to be their high offer. Again, only time will tell. I mean, you talked to North Korea a year ago. They say we'll never give up our nukes, so we got to keep those kind of things in mind. And that happened to be Trump's main complaint when he was leaving the deal. Not the fact that Iran was capable of building a nuke, but the fact that Iran has missiles. Now, Trump is most likely looking to ease tensions because there's a push amongst the Israeli lobby in the United States and just amongst basically all the warmongering groups to recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, so the United States would have to defend it if Assad or Iran were to try to retake it. In the unlikely possibility they would.
Yeah. The Golan Heights seem to be becoming increasingly important. Maybe they're just a card at the moment. It's still, the Straits of Hormuz that are number one in importance. Um, I don't see Iran giving up its ballistic missiles. They're not. It would be suicide. Quite honestly,
I mean,
I'm of the rare opinion for people in the dissident right, I suppose, who actually thinks the deal with Obama and Iran was actually pretty good. What Trump is going to get out of this, I don't know exactly. He could be quite successful. He does have to juggle a lot of various factions, as you say, are in a state of a kind of a mini civil war right now. Just look at all the people who demeaned him during the run-up to the election are on his staff now. I would also I would also add that uh, it will not be a huge loss if Trump doesn't come up with a great deal for Iran. This is not going to be an important issue for 2020 or for the primaries. You
now
know,
a
just
way
to be really pragmatic about it.
yeah, I definitely agree. Since again, especially the economy keeps on going the way it is, and Trump doesn't start an outright war with Iran. I think Trump's main goal would be, of course, Iran wouldn't give its missiles, but he could probably talk them down to limiting their capability to produce missiles and limiting the amount of missiles they have in their arsenal. But again, this is all speculation now. Maybe that may be the deal, but um, it was followed by positive comments after Trump basically sent his olive branch that the spokesperson for the Iranian foreign ministry said that a war between the U.S. and Iran is not to be expected. So that
Mhm.
is a sign of hope that an Iranian government official is saying that. Now, immediately after this exchange, uh, the usual suspects want the rails. Now, this also coincides with recent reports that North Korea is, upping its missile construction, as we were discussing. They're trying to paint it as Trump's deal failed. Now, Pompeo made the situation worse in terms of a negotiation with Iran by coming out and laying out preconditions, which Trump said he would be willing to forego all preconditions to meet with Iranian officials. Now, Rouhani has then reached out to Europe to save the deal. Now, Europe may try to reach out to the U.S. to rejoin the deal, or at least lift sanctions. Now, of course, the EU, Europe, these European powers aren't going to have the weight to throw around at the U.S. that we have to throw around at them. But they could, instead of using the stick, use the carrot. They could offer, oh, hey, we'll lift some tariffs, we'll lift some steel tariffs or car tariffs if you agree to, reopen negotiations with Iran. Merkel could come out and say that, because I know the European powers are actually very dedicated to the Iran deal, as, their comments when Trump left. Now, so, we could see something like that, not necessarily that Europe tries to bully Trump back into it, but they try to, bribe him back into it, which I think that would work, and
I think it's an excellent point.
I think his base would also prove, like, oh, hey, we knocked out some trade barriers with Europe. So what if we have to deal with the Iranians, whatever? But that's good for the American worker. That's good for the economy. So that's what's really going to boil down to, and that's pretty much what everything boils down to the average voter. Now,
yeah, I would agree with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of people think, like, oh, on both sides, like, oh, Europe isn't going to be able to bully this, and then you have the left saying, I hope Europe bullies us back into us. But again, if Europe wants to negotiate with the United States, they got to make concessions. They got to sweeten the pot. They have to, come from, again, with the carrot. I know I'm repeating myself here, but Iran, actually, this happened today, began to conduct drills near the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, this is because of the recent tensions. They usually do this every fall, as well as the United States. But I heard an interesting comment the other day that it takes an entire aircraft carrier group to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, but it only takes one U.S. destroyer to close it. So, I'm not looking to provoke Iran. I'm not looking for a standoff or a war. But, when it comes down to it, keeping the Strait of Hormuz open is important for oil trade, and the U.S. definitely has the upper hand there, despite being in Iran's backyard. But Netanyahu, of course, had to come out and make his comments. You can tell Netanyahu is very nervous based on how hawkish he's been lately. He's afraid, and probably for his office, the fact that he's probably going to get ousted next election. So he's been very hawkish, trying to say, I'm the only one who can defend Israel with my, foreign policy. And he threatened Iran if they would block the mouth of the Red Sea, of which, of course, the Strait of Hormuz is.
Yeah, and that's what I meant when I said earlier that expect things to start heating up, in the Persian Gulf, Straits of Hormuz, once the sanctions kick in. Uh, there's still a lot, there's still at least 3 months till then. I don't know what's going to happen, but if they do, um, we'll see. All bets are off. Yeah, that's my take. It's not maybe as positive or pleasant, but I mean, I welcome. For instance, I welcome the statements made by both Mattis and Iran. That there won't be a war. That's encouraging.
Well, again, they've laid out, neither side is really looking for a conflict, because it would be very bloody for both sides. And as we've laid this out, like I said, this comes back around to the point, if there's going to be a conflict, it's probably going to be in Yemen or Lebanon with Hezbollah, because, we're not going to see direct confrontation with Iran. We may see some tension, some, naval skirmishes or blockades or, drills near the Strait of Hormuz, but granted, that's been going on for the past, 39 years. That would be nothing new. Just that we're bumping them up a little. I think people are actually making a bit of concern about this. But of course, it's a scenario to keep your eye on. I'm not trying to dismiss it. But again, I just don't see the possibility for war. Like I said, even amongst the most ardent neocons. I mean, honestly, we're at the point where Nikki Haley is more hawkish on Iran than John Bolton is. So make of that what you will. But again, as I was saying, not all hope is lost, because, as I said earlier, Iranian positions were moved away from the Golan Heights, which implies there's been back-channel negotiations. Now, it could have come out months later that Trump sent someone to meet with Rouhani, similar to how he sent Pompeo to North Korea. Now, grant he would have sent, I doubt he would have sent Pompeo in this case. Probably would have dug up some other, negotiator to go in that place. But perhaps this is an agreed upon deal during the Trump-Putin summit. And, the situation is still very similar to Trump's strategy with North Korea. It's just that Iran has a lot more weight to throw around, and that we'll have to wait for the sanctions to kick in before it really becomes a North Korea situation to the point where he could, bully them into a summit. Now, uh, Russia and China still play a major factor, but granted, like I said, during that deal, not to mention all the leverage we have over China economically, we could shape the situation again. Uh, you know, things. My prediction for Iran is, things stay the same way they've been for the past, 40 years, and we don't really see a conflict. We just wait until either America, completely decreases its role, or there's some internal revolt in Iran because, that kind of thing always happens with these kind of regimes. But ultimately, you may have a more pessimistic view. Like I said, if I'm going to fear anything, I'm going to fear what's going to happen in, Lebanon or, especially Yemen. But yeah, in terms of conflict with Iran, which how I've ended, the past three shows, unlikely, but still concerning.
Yeah, and in fact, once the sanctions kick in, we could see, like for instance, last week, if I'm not mistaken, or was it earlier this week, there was a Saudi tanker that was attacked, and it was blamed on the Iranians, or it was blamed on Houthi forces that the Iranians are backing, and so on. And
But granted, Saudi Arabia's been saying that stuff since 2015.
well, yes, okay, but
Anytime any kind of events happen.
right. So, yes, I'm trying to describe sort of, an event that could happen that could be a false flag, for lack of a better term, um, come November. And you're right, the two hotspots that I would bet on are going to be Yemen, and secondarily, I would say Lebanon, and not necessarily there. But again, I say all bets are off. I'll wait and see what happens in November. Um, and see, just how much tension builds up. I don't know how important this is to Trump. It's not that important at all to his electorate, um, and I think that matters to him. Um, we'll see where it goes, but generally the news isn't as dire as it was last week, which had all kinds of hyperbolic reactions and so on.
Or even as dire it was, like, early on in the Trump North Korea, sparring. And you got to remember, Trump said as early as May 2017 he'd be willing to meet with Kim Jong Un, and it took
Yes.
until June 2018. So this thing is a slow process if you're going to meet with these kind of leaders. Now,
Mhm.
I actually wouldn't say a meeting is completely unlikely. I would give it the 35-65 chance to the point where if it would happen, it'd be a bit surprising, but you can understand why. But if it
Mhm.
didn't, like, that makes a lot of sense. So as usual, I take the more optimistic view. I don't know whether I just have that viewpoint or whether I try to justify it to myself or whether that's just my analysis. But yeah, fundamentally, just keep your eye on things, and of course, you have a voice. Even politicians don't care what you individually think. Uh, you know, Within a crowd, basically, if they feel that their power is threatened, they will act. So, if worst comes to worst, call the White House, write your senator, all that kind of stuff. But this has been the War Report. I know it's been of a bit short of episode today. This is one of the few times I've actually cut it under an hour, but I still think it was content rich. I hope everyone else thinks
I
so.
think
But
very content rich.
Uh, and sorry about the guy in the chat. We're actually just closing now. Sorry you were late, but of course you can
Sorry.
watch it afterwards. Everyone can share it around, hit that like button. All my links are down in the description if you're interested in that. But it's been the War Report. I'm Constantine. This is of course GSP with me, and goodbye.